Storytelling. The Price of Pennies. The Ballad of the Newsboys' Strike. Imagine a city choked by concrete and ambition, where titans of industry ruled with an iron fist, and the very news that fueled the nation was carried on the shoulders of forgotten children. In the sweltering summer of 1899, in the chaotic, unforgiving streets of New York City, a war was brewing. It wasn't fought with bullets or grand armies, but with raw courage, ragged determination, and the fierce, defiant cries of thousands of impoverished children. These were the newsboys and newsgirls, the gritty, unsung heroes of a bygone era, whose voices, usually lost in the clamor of horse-drawn carriages and shouted headlines, were about to ignite a revolution against the most powerful men in America, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Their fight, born of desperation and fueled by an unwavering belief in fairness, would not just change their lives, but would echo through the very foundations of American labor, proving that even the smallest voices, when united, could shake the towers of power. This is their story, the Ballad of the Newsboys' Strike. The raw heart of the city. New York City, 1899, a monstrous, magnificent beast of a city, perpetually hungry, perpetually growing. Its streets a churning river of humanity, pulsed with the relentless rhythm of commerce and aspiration. Gaslights flickered to life as dusk settled over cobblestone streets, slick with horse droppings and the day's grime. Towering buildings, newly reaching for the heavens, scraped against a sky often obscured by the smoke of 1,000 chimneys and the perpetual haze of industry. It was a city of stark, almost brutal contrasts. Glittering mansions on Fifth Avenue, where the Gilded Age elite reveled in their unimaginable wealth, existing just miles, and often mere blocks, from the teeming, squalid tenements of the Lower East Side, where poverty was a constant, gnawing companion. At the very bottom of this sprawling, intricate hierarchy, beneath the factory workers, the dock hands, the shopkeepers, and the street vendors, existed a peculiar, vibrant, and fiercely independent subculture, the newsboys, and, though less recognized, the newsgirls. They were the circulatory system of the city's information, the human conduits through whom the daily happenings, the political scandals, the sensational murders, and the national triumphs reached the public. Without them, the grand pronouncements of the New York World and the New York Journal, the twin titans of yellow journalism, locked in a brutal circulation war, would remain mere ink on paper, trapped within the printing presses. For these children, life was a daily grind, a constant negotiation with hunger, cold, and the indifference of a bustling metropolis. Many were orphans, having lost parents to disease, accident, or the sheer grinding force of poverty. Others came from families barely scraping by, their meager earnings often the difference between a loaf of stale bread and an empty stomach. They were the ultimate entrepreneurs of the street, honed by necessity, quick-witted, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a resilience that would shame many an adult. Their day began long before the first rays of sun pierced the concrete canyons. Around midnight or 1 a.m., depending on the edition, the first bundles of newspapers would arrive at the distribution offices, the shacks clustered around Park Row, just across from City Hall and the Brooklyn Bridge. This was the undisputed kingdom of the newsboys, a rough and tumble parliament where camaraderie mingled with fierce competition. The air inside these shacks was thick with the smell of fresh ink, cheap tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Boys, some as young as 6 or 7, others in their mid-teens, jostled for position, their voices a cacophony of shouts, jokes, and arguments. They weren't employees in the traditional sense.
They bought their papers up front from the newspaper companies, usually for 50 cents per 100 copies, and then sold them for a penny apiece. Their profit margin, their very livelihood, was exactly half a cent per paper. It was a brutal business, especially for the evening editions, which often sold for half a cent each, leaving the newsie with an even slimmer quarter-cent profit. A nickel might buy a meager meal, a slice of bread and a cup of coffee. A dime could secure a spot in a cheap lodging house, a lodging for a flop, which was usually just a bare cot in a crowded, unsanitary room. For a newsboy, every half cent counted. It was the difference between eating and starving, between sleeping under a roof and huddling in a doorway. Among the throng, certain personalities stood out, their names echoing through the grimy streets like legends. There was Kid Blink, a charismatic one-eyed orator with a penchant for grand pronouncements, whose voice could cut through the din of the city. There was Racetrack Higgins, nimble and quick, always finding the best corners. Spot Conlon, a tough but fair leader, held court over his own small crew. These were not just nicknames, they were identities forged in the crucible of the streets, markers of respect, fear, or admiration. The struggle for existence began with securing the papers. The Newsies, or the Newsboys as they were generically known, would often pool their limited funds to buy bundles. They had to be quick, as the best-selling papers, with the most sensational headlines, went fast. Then came the frantic rush to their chosen territories, prime corners near train stations, ferry terminals, theaters, or busy intersections. Their sales pitch was a performance, a rapid-fire shout that projected confidence and urgency. Extra, extra, read all about it. War in Cuba, sensation, read all about it. The New York World, owned by the Hungarian-born immigrant Joseph Pulitzer, was a pioneer of the new journalism. Pulitzer believed in reaching the masses, simplifying language, and focusing on human interest stories, scandals, and crusades against corruption. His famous mantra was accuracy, 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 but his methods often blurred the lines between reporting and sensationalism. His World was a vibrant, often aggressive newspaper filled with illustrations and bold headlines. His fiercest rival was William Randolph Hearst, scion of a California mining fortune, who had invaded the New York market with his journal and quickly surpassed Pulitzer in sheer audacity. Hearst famously declared, "The public likes what he reads," and he gave them sensationalism in spades. He dispatched correspondents to cover the Spanish-American War, even taking credit for starting it. "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Both men understood that circulation was king, and to win the circulation war, they needed the newsboys. The summer of 1899 had brought a particularly oppressive heat to New York, mirroring the growing discontent simmering beneath the city's surface. The Spanish-American War, which had provided a massive boom in newspaper sales just a year prior, was over. During the war, special extras were printed constantly, and the public, hungry for updates, bought them in droves. To capitalize on this, Hearst and Pulitzer had raised the wholesale price of a bundle of 100 newspapers from 50 cents to 60 cents for these extras, a temporary measure they promised to revert once the war ended. But the war had ended, and the price had not reverted. For the powerful publishers, 10 cents per 100 papers was a negligible increase, a mere rounding error in their vast fortunes. For the newsboys, however, it was a devastating blow. That 10 cents represented 20% of their already razor-thin profit margin. It meant 20 fewer papers they could afford to buy, or 2 fewer meals, or another night spent shivering in a doorway. This seemingly small price hike became the ultimate insult, the final straw. They were not employees with contracts or unions. They were independent contractors, buying a product and reselling it. They had no legal recourse, no formal representation. But they had something else: solidarity, a shared hardship, and a collective fury that was slowly, inexorably reaching a boiling point. The invisible architects of the city's news were about to make themselves seen, and their voices, though young, were about to demand to be heard. The great beast of New York was about to discover that even the smallest, most overlooked elements in its system could bring it to a grinding halt. The stage was set for a confrontation, not between titans of industry, but between the powerful and the powerless. A battle for a single, crucial dime.
The gathering storm, the seeds of discontent. The 10-cent price hike might have seemed insignificant to the newspaper barons, a mere rounding error in their opulent ledgers, but for the newsboys, it was a profound injustice, a direct assault on their already precarious livelihoods. The summer of 1899 was a crucible, forging discontent into resolve and disparate cries of frustration into a unified roar. The newsboys were not a monolithic entity. They represented a diverse cross-section of New York's working class. Many were recent immigrants, or the children of immigrants: Irish, Italian, Jewish, German. They spoke with a polyglot of accents, but shared a common language of hardship. Some were genuine orphans, sleeping in hallways, parks, where the dreaded 5-cent lodging houses, where crowded, unsanitary conditions bred disease and despair. Others had families, often large ones, living in cramped tenements, and their earnings were crucial for rent, food, or heating. The bond between newsboys was forged in shared struggle. They operated within a distinct social ecosystem, one defined by specific territories, rivalries, and an unwritten code of conduct. They knew the best corners, the most generous customers, the most lenient cops, and the toughest competition. They learned early to be self-reliant, to trust few outside their immediate circles, and to develop a shrewd understanding of human nature. They also learned the power of collective action, even if it was just banding together to scare off a bully or share a warm meal on a cold night. The price hike gnawed at them daily. They might buy a bundle of 100 papers, costing them 60 cents. If they managed to sell all 100 at a penny each, they made $1, netting 40 cents profit. Before the hike, that profit was 50 cents. 10 cents might not sound like much, but for a newsboy, it was a significant portion of their daily take. It meant they might have to sell an extra 20 papers just to make the same amount they did before. And selling those extra papers was not always easy, especially after the wartime frenzy had subsided. Complaints began to ripple through the newsboy community. At first, they were grumbles, individual laments exchanged outside the distribution offices. The rich guys always squeezing the poor fellas. Pulitzer and Hearst, they got enough dough to sink a ship. Why they gotta take our pennies? Another would echo. But these grumbles started to coalesce. The outrage was universal, spanning across different age groups, ethnicities, and territories. The distribution shacks on Park Row became the epicenters of this growing unrest. This is where the newsboys congregated, where they bought their papers, exchanged gossip, and forged their bonds. It was also where the palpable injustice of the price hike was most acutely felt. The representatives from the World and the Journal who managed these shacks, though often just middle managers, became the face of the publisher's perceived greed. Among the various groups of newsboys, a few natural leaders emerged. Kid Blank, whose real name was reportedly Louis Belletti, was perhaps the most prominent. Though he was likely a teenager, his exact age is debated, like many newsies. His charisma and booming voice commanded attention. Missing an eye, likely due to a childhood accident or disease common in the tenements, gave him a distinctive, almost mythical aura. He was a natural orator, capable of rousing a crowd with impassioned speeches, a skill honed by years of shouting headlines and haggling on the streets. Then there was Racetrack Higgins, known for his quick wit and agility. Racetrack was a strategic thinker, good at organizing and planning. Dave Simmons and Spot Conlon were other key figures, leaders among their respective gangs or crews. These were not violent gangs in the criminal sense, but rather informal associations of newsboys who worked and often lived together, providing each other with a semblance of family and protection in a harsh world. Spot Conlon, in particular, hailed from Brooklyn and his ability to rally the Brooklyn Newsboys would prove crucial. The initial strategy, if one could call it that, was informal. Small groups of newsboys would approach the circulation managers, pleading, demanding, or sometimes begging for the old price to be reinstated. But these pleas fell on deaf ears. The managers, acting on orders from above, simply shrugged, or worse, laughed them off. "If you don't like it, don't buy 'em," was the common retort, knowing full well the newsboys had little choice. This condescension only fueled the anger. The newsboys felt insulted, dismissed. They were children, yes, but they were also working professionals, essential cogs in a multi-million-dollar industry. They knew their worth, even if the rich publishers didn't. They began to realize that individual complaints were useless. They needed a unified voice, a collective action. The idea of a strike began to circulate, a whisper at first, then a murmur, then a confident shout. "We gotta strike 'em! No more papers until they lower the price." The concept of a strike, though familiar to adult laborers, was a radical notion for a group of children who had no formal union, no official representation. But they had seen strikes before. They had sold papers reporting on strikes by factory workers, miners, and railroad men. They understood the basic principle: withhold labor, create economic pressure, and force concessions. The initial planning was rudimentary, relying on word of mouth and the newsboys' innate communication networks. Meetings were held in parks, in back alleys, and on street corners, away from the prying eyes of the newspaper companies. Kid Blink, with his powerful voice, quickly became the de facto leader, articulating their grievances and stirring their resolve. Racetrack Higgins and Spot Conlon worked tirelessly, spreading the word among their Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island counterparts, ensuring that the strike wasn't just a Manhattan affair. The target was clear: the World and the Journal. These were the two papers that had maintained the increased price, and thus they became the primary enemy. The other smaller papers, like the New York Times, the Tribune, and the Sun, still sold their papers at 50 cents per hundred or had a different business model, so they were initially spared. This strategic focus allowed the newsboys to concentrate their limited power. The tipping point came quickly in late July 1899. A particularly slow news day, combined with the lingering heat and the daily frustration, ignited a spark. On July 18th, a small group of newsboys in Long Island City, Queens, decided they'd had enough. They refused to buy papers from the Journal. Their protest was small, uncoordinated, but it was the first crack in the dam. The news spread rapidly across the river into Manhattan. The next day, more newsboys joined. The movement was gaining momentum, fueled by the conviction that if they didn't fight now, they might never get another chance. The publishers, meanwhile, were oblivious. They dismissed the rumblings as childish tantrums, easily quelled. They believed they held all the power. They had the printing presses, the money, the influence. The newsboys had nothing but their bare hands and their loud voices. But what they lacked in material resources, they made up for in sheer numbers, courage, and an unexpected ability to organize. The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break.
The strike begins. Extra, extra, no more papers. The morning of July 20th, 1899, dawned hot and humid, like countless other summer days in New York City. But this day would be different. This was the day the newsboys' strike truly began. The initial rumblings, the scattered protests, had coalesced into a unified, defiant refusal. The scene at the New York World and New York Journal distribution shacks on Park Row was usually one of chaotic energy. Boys jostling, shouting, money changing hands, bundles of papers being slung over shoulders. But this morning, there was a stark, eerie difference. There were still boys, thousands of them, but they weren't buying papers. They were refusing them. No more bleedin' Journal. Pulitzer and Hearst, they robbin' the poor. 50 cents a hundred, or no papers sold! The shouts echoed through Park Row, a defiant chorus replacing the usual sales pitches. The newsboys had gathered en masse, forming an angry, determined blockade. Leading the charge was Kid Blink, his one eye blazing with righteous anger. His voice, usually used for hawking headlines, now boomed with a powerful, persuasive fervor. "We gotta stick together, fellas. They think we're just kids, but we got power in numbers. No papers sold until they give us a fair shake." His words were met with thunderous cheers and shouts of agreement. Other key figures, like racetrack Higgins and Spot Conlon, worked the crowd, ensuring solidarity, urging on the hesitant. Spot Conlon particularly had rallied the Brooklyn Newsboys, ensuring that the strike wasn't just a Manhattan phenomenon. Groups of newsboys from different boroughs and neighborhoods, usually fiercely competitive, now stood side by side, united against a common enemy. The circulation managers, initially dismissive, quickly realized this was no ordinary protest. The newsboys weren't just complaining, they were actively refusing to buy. And more importantly, they were actively preventing others from buying. Any newsboy who dared to try and cross the picket line, or scab as they were quickly labeled, was met with a torrent of jeers, threats, and sometimes physical force. "Scab! Scab! Go home, you rat!" would be the cry. Papers would be snatched, torn, and stomped into the filthy street. Fights broke out, quick, brutal skirmishes that characterized the rough-and-tumble existence of the newsboys. The message was clear. No one was to sell the World or the Journal until the price was reduced. The impact was immediate and dramatic. The World and the Journal, usually selling hundreds of thousands of copies daily, saw their circulation plummet. Bundles of unsellable newspapers piled up in the distribution offices. The roar of the printing presses continued, churning out thousands of copies, but without the newsboys, these papers were effectively dead on arrival. The strike committee, though informal, quickly established itself. Kid Blink, Racetrack Higgins, David Simmons, and others became the public faces of the movement. They understood the importance of communication and strategy. They organized mass meetings, often in City Hall Park or at the new Irving Hall, a popular gathering place. These meetings were boisterous affairs, filled with rousing speeches, passionate arguments, and fervent pledges of solidarity. At these rallies, the newsboys articulated their grievances with surprising clarity. They weren't asking for exorbitant wages, they were asking for a fair price, for the 10 cents that had been unjustly taken from them. They explained how that 10 cents impacted their ability to eat, to sleep in a warm bed, to survive. Their arguments, though delivered in street slang, resonated with a fundamental sense of justice. The older established newspapers, like the New York Times, Tribune, and Sun, initially viewed the strike with a mix of amusement and disdain. They reported on it, often with a patronizing tone, focusing on the novelty of children striking. But as the strike dragged on, and as the World and the Journal's circulation continued to suffer, their reporting became more serious. The newsboys, by their sheer audacity and determination, were becoming a legitimate news story themselves. The publishers, Hearst and Pulitzer, remained largely invisible, shielded by their vast wealth and layers of management. They instructed their circulation managers to hold firm, believing the children would soon tire and return to work. They even tried to use strikebreakers, hiring older men or street toughs to try and sell their papers. But these attempts were largely unsuccessful. The newsboys were far too numerous, far too organized, and far too intimidating for these replacement sellers. Any non-newsboy attempting to sell a World or Journal was quickly surrounded, their papers confiscated and destroyed. The strike wasn't just confined to Manhattan. Newsboys in Brooklyn, Queens, and even parts of New Jersey joined the boycott. Spot Conlon's efforts in Brooklyn were particularly effective. He ensured that the Brooklyn Bridge, a vital artery for newspaper distribution, was effectively blockaded. Newsboys from both sides of the bridge united to stop any papers from crossing. The tactics of the newsboys were direct and effective. 1. Mass picketing, blocking access to distribution points. 2. Scab bashing, physically preventing anyone else from selling the targeted papers. This often involved tearing up papers, but sometimes escalated to fistfights. 3. Public rallies, holding large public meetings to air grievances and maintain morale. 4. Media attention, leveraging their own story to gain sympathy and pressure the publishers.
The strike, initially met with skepticism, slowly began to capture the public imagination. People saw the Newsboys every day, hard-working and often ragged. They understood the struggle for a living wage, even if it was just a few pennies. The image of powerful, wealthy newspaper owners squeezing an extra penny from these already impoverished children struck a nerve. Even some police officers, many of whom had grown up in similar circumstances, often turned a blind eye to the Newsboys' more aggressive tactics or even quietly expressed support. As the days turned into a week, the pressure mounted on Pulitzer and Hearst. Their advertising revenue was tied to circulation numbers. With their papers not being sold, advertisers began to pull their ads or demand refunds. The financial losses, initially dismissed as temporary, were quickly becoming substantial. The Newsboys, far from being a nuisance, were proving to be a formidable economic force. A particularly poignant moment occurred when Kid Blink, in an interview with a reporter from a sympathetic paper, eloquently articulated their position. "We ain't got no homes. We gotta sleep in the streets or in them lousy lodging houses. We gotta eat what we can find. And these fellas, Hearst and Pulitzer, they got millions. They got fancy houses and carriages, and they're taking away our last dime. It ain't right." His words, printed in the rival papers, resonated deeply. The strike wasn't just about the price of papers. It became a symbol of a larger struggle for dignity and fairness. It was the exploited standing up to the exploiters, the voiceless demanding to be heard. The roar of the Newsboys on Park Row was no longer just the sound of a protest. It was the sound of a nascent labor movement, bubbling up from the unlikeliest of sources, forcing the giants of journalism to pay attention. The city that never slept was waking up to a new kind of power, the power of united children. The orator and the opportunist, leaders of the strike. Every movement needs a voice, a face, a galvanizing presence. For the Newsboys' strike of 1899, that presence was most powerfully embodied in Louis Belletti, better known to the streets and the burgeoning press as Kid Blink. He was not formally elected, but his charisma, his passion, and his sheer ability to articulate the Newsboys' grievances made him their undeniable leader. Kid Blink's story was typical of many Newsboys. Born into poverty, likely orphaned or abandoned, forced to make his own way from an incredibly young age. He was perhaps a teenager, but the exact age of many Newsies was fluid, often guessed, and rarely documented. His most distinguishing feature was his missing eye, which some accounts attribute to a childhood accident or disease, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of street life. This physical mark, far from being a disability, became part of his legend, giving him a formidable appearance and an unforgettable nickname. Blink possessed an innate understanding of rhetoric and public speaking. His voice, honed by years of shouting headlines over the din of city traffic, had a gravelly power that commanded attention. He used colorful, expressive street slang, but his arguments were surprisingly clear and logical. He instinctively knew how to tap into the collective frustration of his peers and transform it into a powerful, unified emotion. When Kid Blink spoke, the Newsboys listened. When he called for action, they followed. His speeches at the mass meetings were legendary. He would stand on a makeshift platform, perhaps an overturned crate, a wagon, or the steps of a building, and addressed the throng of Newsboys with passionate conviction. He didn't just talk about the 10 cents. He painted vivid pictures of what that 10 cents meant: an empty belly, a cold night, a lost chance at a warm meal. He framed the strike not just as a demand for money, but as a fight for dignity and justice against the avarice of the rich. Fellas,
Storytelling. "We're fighting against the biggest bullies in the city," he'd declare, his voice ringing out. "Hearst and Pulitzer, they think they can walk all over us 'cause we're just kids. But we ain't just kids. We're the ones who sell their papers. We're the ones who make 'em rich. And if we don't sell, they don't make nothing. So we gotta stick together, strong as an army. No buying, no selling, not till they give us what's fair." His words were met with thunderous applause, shouts, and stomping feet. Blink understood the theatricality of leadership. He knew how to inspire, how to maintain morale, and how to keep the thousands of restless newsboys united against powerful adversaries. While Kid Blink was the emotional heart and fiery orator, others provided the organizational backbone. Racetrack Higgins, another prominent newsboy, acted as a shrewd strategist and organizer. He was quick-witted and understood the logistics of the strike, helping to coordinate efforts across different parts of the city. He might not have had Blink's oratorical flair, but he had a practical mind and a knack for getting things done. Another crucial figure was Spot Conlon, the leader of the Brooklyn Newsboys. Brooklyn was a vital territory for newspaper sales, and without the support of its Newsies, the strike would have been significantly weakened. Spot was known for his toughness and his ability to rally his own contingent. He ensured that the Brooklyn Bridge, a crucial choke point for paper distribution, was effectively picketed. His unwavering loyalty and strong leadership in Brooklyn were instrumental in extending the strike's reach and impact. The presence of newsboys from all boroughs, uniting for a common cause, spoke volumes about the widespread nature of their grievance. The Newsboys Strike Committee, though informal and ever-evolving, functioned surprisingly effectively. They held daily meetings, planned rallies, decided on tactics, and tried to maintain discipline among the ranks. This self-organization was a remarkable feat for a group of primarily uneducated children, demonstrating an innate understanding of collective action and social protest. The public's perception of these newsboy leaders was complex. Sympathetic newspapers often portrayed them as plucky, resilient, and articulate underdogs. Cartoons depicting tiny, determined newsboys facing down giant, bloated newspaper tycoons. This positive media coverage was critical in swaying public opinion. For a brief moment, the newsboys became heroes, symbols of the common person standing up to corporate greed. But the leaders also faced immense pressure and temptation. The newspaper companies, desperate to break the strike, began to offer bribes to key figures. They understood that if they could fracture the leadership, the entire movement might crumble. And indeed, this tactic almost worked. Kid Blink, despite his passionate speeches, was not immune to the harsh realities of hunger and poverty. There were reports that at one point, he and a few other leaders were swayed by an offer from the Journal to break the strike. They allegedly agreed to accept a smaller concession, a buyback of unsold papers rather than a full price rollback, and encouraged some newsboys to return to selling. This act of perceived betrayal sent shockwaves through the newsboy community. Accusations of selling out flew, and anger flared. Kid Blink found himself temporarily alienated from many of his followers. The solidarity, so painstakingly built, threatened to unravel. It was a stark reminder of the vulnerability of leaders, especially young, impoverished ones facing overwhelming pressure. However, the strike had gained too much momentum to be easily derailed. Other newsboys, deeply committed to the cause, quickly stepped forward to reaffirm the original demands. The rank and file refused to be swayed by a partial concession. They had committed to 50 cents a hundred or no paper sold, and they were sticking to it. The movement, in a sense, became larger than any single leader. This temporary crisis ultimately reinforced the newsboys' resolve. It proved that their cause was genuine and widely felt, not dependent on the whims of one or two charismatic figures. Kid Blink, realizing his mistake, quickly recommitted to the full strike, perhaps chastened by the fierce reaction of his peers. His brief wavering only served to highlight the desperate circumstances these children faced and the immense courage it took to stand firm against such powerful forces. The newsboy strike was not just a spontaneous outburst. It was a testament to the power of grassroots organizing led by an unexpected cast of characters. From the fiery rhetoric of Kid Blink to the strategic acumen of Racetrack Higgins and the unwavering resolve of Spot Conlon, these boys and girls carved out a space for themselves in the annals of labor history, proving that leaders can emerge from the unlikeliest of places armed with nothing but conviction and courage. Their voices, once just shouts on a street corner, were now echoing across the city, demanding justice. The city reacts, public sympathy and corporate arrogance. As the Newsboys' strike entered its second week, New York City found itself in an unusual situation. The city that thrived on information was facing a severe news drought, at least from its two most popular, sensationalistic newspapers. The streets felt different. The familiar shouts of "extra, extra" from World and Journal sellers were largely absent, replaced by the defiant chants of the strikers. The impact on the New York World and the New York Journal was devastating. Circulation plummeted from hundreds of thousands to mere thousands. Advertisers, whose rates were based on readership, began to panic. They threatened to pull their ads, demanding refunds for the days their messages weren't reaching the masses. This was the real leverage of the Newsboys, not their physical strength, but their economic power as the indispensable distribution network. Hearst and Pulitzer, who had dismissed the children as a mere nuisance, were now bleeding money. The other major newspapers, the New York Times, Tribune, Sun, Herald, and Press, were having a field day. Since their prices to newsboys hadn't been raised, they continued to be sold. Their circulation figures soared as the public turned to them for news. They covered the strike extensively, often with a clear bias in favor of the newsboys. They saw an opportunity to embarrass their cutthroat competitors. Their reporting painted a vivid picture of the struggling newsboys, highlighting their poverty, their resilience, and the perceived greed of the publishers. Cartoons depicting a tiny, determined newsboy squaring off against a bloated, top-hatted Hearst or Pulitzer became common. This positive media coverage was critical in swaying public opinion. For a brief moment, the newsboys became heroes, symbols of the common person standing up to corporate greed. However, the leaders also faced immense pressure and temptation. The newspaper companies, desperate to break the strike, began to offer bribes to key figures. They understood that if they could fracture the leadership, the entire movement might crumble. And indeed, this tactic almost worked. Kid Blink, despite his passionate speeches, was not immune to the harsh realities of hunger and poverty. There were reports that at one point, he and a few other leaders were swayed by an offer from the Journal to break the strike. They allegedly agreed to accept a smaller concession, a buyback of unsold papers, rather than a full price rollback, and encouraged some newsboys to return to selling. This act of perceived betrayal sent shockwaves through the newsboy community. Accusations of selling out flew, and anger flared. Kid Blink found himself temporarily alienated from many of his followers. The solidarity, so painstakingly built, threatened to unravel. It was a stark reminder of the vulnerability of leaders, especially young, impoverished ones facing overwhelming pressure. However, the strike had gained too much momentum to be easily derailed. Other newsboys, deeply committed to the cause, quickly stepped forward to reaffirm the original demands. The rank and file refused to be swayed by a partial concession. They had committed to 50 cents a hundred or no paper sold, and they were sticking to it. The movement, in a sense, became larger than any single leader. This temporary crisis ultimately reinforced the newsboys' resolve. It proved that their cause was genuine and widely felt, not dependent on the whims of one or two charismatic figures. Kid Blink, realizing his mistake, quickly recommitted to the full strike, perhaps chastened by the fierce reaction of his peers. His brief wavering only served to highlight the desperate circumstances these children faced and the immense courage it took to stand firm against such powerful forces. The newsboy strike was not just a spontaneous outburst. It was a testament to the power of grassroots organizing led by an unexpected cast of characters. From the fiery rhetoric of Kid Blink to the strategic acumen of Racetrack Higgins and the unwavering resolve of Spot Conlon, these boys and girls carved out a space for themselves in the annals of labor history, proving that leaders can emerge from the unlikeliest of places armed with nothing but conviction and courage. Their voices, once just shouts on a street corner, were now echoing across the city, demanding justice. The city reacts, public sympathy and corporate arrogance. As the Newsboys' strike entered its second week, New York City found itself in an unusual situation. The city that thrived on information was facing a severe news drought, at least from its two most popular, sensationalistic newspapers. The streets felt different. The familiar shouts of "extra, extra" from World and Journal sellers were largely absent, replaced by the defiant chants of the strikers. The impact on the New York World and the New York Journal was devastating. Circulation plummeted from hundreds of thousands to mere thousands. Advertisers, whose rates were based on readership,
Storytelling began to panic. They threatened to pull their ads, demanding refunds for the days their messages weren't reaching the masses. This was the real leverage of the Newsboys, not their physical strength, but their economic power as the indispensable distribution network. Hearst and Pulitzer, who had dismissed the children as a mere nuisance, were now bleeding money. The other major newspapers, the New York Times, Tribune, Sun, Herald, and Press, were having a field day. Since their prices to newsboys hadn't been raised, they continued to be sold. Their circulation figures soared as the public turned to them for news. They covered the strike extensively, often with a clear bias in favor of the newsboys. They saw an opportunity to embarrass their cutthroat competitors, Hearst and Pulitzer. Their reporting painted a vivid picture of the struggling newsboys, highlighting their poverty, their resilience, and the perceived greed of the publishers. Cartoons depicting a tiny, determined newsboy squaring off against a bloated, top-hatted Hearst or Pulitzer became common. This sympathetic media coverage was crucial in turning public opinion decisively in favor of the strikers. New Yorkers, from shopkeepers to socialites, began to rally behind the newsboys. They saw them every day, cold, hungry, and hard-working. They understood the struggle for a living wage, even if it was just a few pennies. The sight of wealthy newspaper magnates squeezing an extra dime from these already impoverished children struck a raw nerve. Support wasn't just passive sympathy. Donations of food, money, and even old clothes began to pour in for the striking newsboys. Businesses, particularly small shops and restaurants in working-class neighborhoods, offered free meals or discounts to boys flashing their makeshift strike badges. The working-class communities, themselves no stranger to labor struggles, saw the newsboys' fight as their own. However, not everyone was sympathetic. Some viewed the newsboys as unruly delinquents, disrupting the peace and engaging in street violence. The more aggressive tactics, like scab bashing and paper destruction, drew criticism. The police, while often sympathetic, still had a duty to maintain order. There were instances of newsboys being arrested, usually for minor disturbances or assault. But even these arrests often backfired on the publishers, generating more negative publicity and painting the police as agents of the wealthy. The publishers, meanwhile, maintained a facade of corporate arrogance. They initially refused to negotiate directly with the newsboys, dismissing them as unorganized children. They tried various tactics to break the strike. 1. Hiring scabs. They brought in older men, toughs, or new, inexperienced boys to try and sell papers. These attempts largely failed, as the sheer numbers and fierce determination of the striking newsboys effectively blocked their efforts. 2. Delivering directly. They tried to use wagons and trucks to deliver papers directly to customers or newsstands. But the newsboys were nimble. They would swarm the wagons, snatching papers, or intimidate newsstand owners who dared to sell the targeted dailies. 3. Ignoring the demands. They publicly stated that they would not negotiate with children and that the price change was justified. This intransigence only hardened the newsboys' resolve. It reinforced their belief that the publishers saw them as disposable, insignificant. It transformed a purely economic grievance into a fight for respect and recognition. One particularly notable incident involved a mass rally at New Irving Hall. Thousands of newsboys from all over the city packed the hall. Kid Blink delivered one of his most powerful speeches, electrifying the crowd. The energy was palpable, a vivid demonstration of their unity and determination. Reporters from the sympathetic papers were present, capturing every passionate word,
ensuring the Newsboys' story reached a wider audience. The strike also highlighted the severe issue of child labor in America. While the Newsboys were independent contractors, their situation was essentially one of child exploitation. Their fight brought a spotlight to the plight of working children, sparking discussions about child welfare and labor laws. Though direct legislative change wasn't an immediate outcome of this specific strike, it contributed to a growing national awareness of the need for child labor reform. As the days turned into a week and a half, the financial losses mounted for Hearst and Pulitzer. Their initial arrogance began to crack under the relentless pressure. The newspaper war, which had defined their rivalry, was now being won by their competitors, not by their own efforts. The Newsboys, by refusing to participate, had inadvertently become the most powerful players in that war. The publisher's biggest fear was not just the immediate loss of revenue, but the potential precedent this strike could set. If a group of children could successfully challenge them, what would stop other, more organized adult labor groups from doing the same? This was a threat to their entire business model and their perception of untouchable corporate power. Behind the scenes, the pressure on Hearst and Pulitzer from advertisers and their own business managers grew intense. The cost of printing thousands of unsellable papers, combined with lost advertising revenue, was becoming unsustainable. The humiliation of being defeated by a band of ragged children was a bitter pill to swallow for such proud, powerful men. The climax was nearing. The Newsboys, against all odds, had held firm. They had galvanized public opinion, withstood corporate pressure, and effectively crippled the distribution of two of the nation's largest newspapers. The city, initially amused, was now watching with bated breath, wondering how this unprecedented battle between the powerful and the powerless would end. The stage was set for negotiation, forced upon the giants by the resilience of the smallest. The uneasy truce, negotiations, and victory. The strike, which had seemed an impossibility to many, had now lasted for nearly 2 weeks, profoundly impacting two of the most powerful newspaper empires in America. The financial losses for Pulitzer's World and Hearst's Journal were staggering. Advertising revenue had plummeted, and unsold papers piled up, a constant, tangible reminder of the Newsboys' power. The public, largely sympathetic to the children, was now openly questioning the publisher's intransigence. The relentless pressure finally forced Hearst and Pulitzer to concede. They understood that continuing to battle the Newsboys was not only economically ruinous, but also a public relations disaster. They couldn't win by force. The Newsboys were too numerous and too determined. They had to negotiate. However, the publishers still refused to deal directly with the children. Instead, they sent their circulation managers to meet with the strike committee. The Newsboys, though young, had learned quickly. They understood the importance of presenting a unified front and sticking to their core demand. The wholesale price of extras must revert to 50 cents per hundred. The negotiations were tense. The publishers' representatives, initially trying to dismiss the Newsboys, quickly realized they were dealing with shrewd, albeit unpolished, negotiators. Kid Blink, Racetrack Higgins, and other committee members presented their case with the conviction born of desperation. They weren't asking for charity. They were demanding fairness. However, the Newsboys did not achieve a full victory on their initial demand. The publishers, while willing to make concessions, were not prepared to completely roll back the price increase. After much back and forth, a compromise was reached, one that both sides could, grudgingly, accept. The agreement had two key components. 1. Buyback policy. The World and the Journal agreed to buy back any unsold extra editions from the Newsboys. This was a crucial concession. Previously, if a newsboy bought 100 papers and only sold 80, he was out the money for the 20 unsold papers. With the buyback policy, he would only pay for the papers he actually sold. This significantly reduced the financial risk for the Newsboys and guaranteed their profit margin of 0.5 cent per paper sold. 2.
no price rollback. The wholesale price of 60 cents per hundred for extras remained. This was a bitter pill for the Newsboys to swallow, as it wasn't their original demand. However, the buyback policy mitigated the impact of the higher price. The agreement was presented to the thousands of newsboys at another mass meeting. There was a mix of triumph and disappointment. The full rollback hadn't been achieved, but the buyback policy was a significant victory, addressing the core financial precarity that had driven the strike. It meant that a newsboy's profit was now guaranteed per paper sold, removing the risk of losing money on unsold copies. Kid Blink, with his characteristic flair, presented the compromise. He emphasized that while they hadn't gotten everything, they had forced the most powerful men in the city to negotiate and concede. They had won respect and a tangible improvement to their working conditions. After much debate and deliberation, the Newsboys voted to accept the terms. On August 2, 1899, the Newsboys' strike officially ended. The Newsboys returned to their posts, shouting headlines once more, but with a renewed sense of dignity and power. The World and the Journal quickly saw their circulation numbers rebound, and the city's news ecosystem returned to its chaotic normal.
Storytelling. While the strike did not lead to a formal unionization of newsboys, its impact was profound and far-reaching. Recognition of power. It demonstrated, unequivocally, that even the most marginalized and powerless workers, in this case children, could exert significant economic leverage when united. It was a potent lesson for the burgeoning labor movement across the country. Improved working conditions. The buyback policy, while not a full-price rollback, was a critical improvement. It stabilized the newsboys' income and reduced their daily financial risk, making their lives slightly less precarious. Media attention to child labor. The strike drew national attention to the plight of working children, particularly newsboys. While direct legislative changes were slow to come, the public discourse around child labor intensified, contributing to the broader movement for child welfare and labor reform that would gain strength in the early 20th century. A precedent for future labor actions. The Newsboys' strike became an inspiring example of successful grassroots activism. It showed that collective action, even without formal union structures, could challenge powerful corporations. A blow to corporate arrogance. Hearst and Pulitzer, two of the most dominant and ruthless figures in American media, were forced to concede in public to a group of children. This was a humbling experience that challenged the prevailing notion of untouchable corporate power. The story of the Newsboys quickly faded from mainstream memory, overshadowed by larger labor disputes and subsequent historical events. Many of the Newsboys, like Kid Blink, Racetrack Higgins, and Spot Conlon, eventually disappeared back into the anonymity of working-class life, their brief moment in the spotlight over. Their individual fates are largely undocumented, a testament to the disposable nature of child labor at the time. However, the spirit of their fight endured. The Newsboys' strike was a powerful, if small, revolution in the history of American labor. It was a testament to the courage, resilience, and innate sense of justice found even in the most overlooked corners of society. It was a powerful demonstration that voices, no matter how young or marginalized, could, when united, rise above the din and force the giants to listen. The price of a penny, and the fight for that penny, had, for a brief, glorious moment, changed the very fabric of New York City and planted a seed of hope in the hearts of working people everywhere. Their ballad, though often unsung, remains a vital note in the symphony of American history. The aftermath, a compromise, not a cure. The cessation of the strike on August 2, 1899, was met with a mix of relief
and renewed intensity in the city. The New York World and the New York Journal were back on the streets in full force, the shouts of the Newsboys once again cutting through the air, albeit with a slightly different resonance. The compromise, the publishers retaining the 60-cent price per hundred for extras, but agreeing to buy back all unsold papers, was a pragmatic victory for the children, securing their profit and mitigating their risk, making their lives slightly less precarious, but it was not the end of their struggle. For Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, two of the most dominant and ruthless figures in American media, the outcome was a public humiliation cloaked in a financial necessity. They had been forced to concede to a group they had openly scorned as insignificant. Their immediate priority was damage control. Their papers, particularly The World, rushed to restore circulation and rehabilitate their image with the public, even running extra-large editions regardless of advertising volume. They had lost millions in revenue, but perhaps more importantly, they had lost face. In the cutthroat world of yellow journalism, image was everything. Hearst, who often championed the common man in his editorials, was exposed as an exploiter of child labor. Pulitzer, who built his reputation on crusades against corruption and injustice, was revealed as equally capable of corporate greed. The strike served as a public rebuke to their hypocrisy, a moment of moral clarity delivered by the very children they sought to profit from. Though they never officially acknowledged the Newsboys Union or met with the leaders, the circulation managers were given strict orders: maintain the buyback system, and most of all, ensure there was no cause for another strike. The newsboy leaders, the charismatic heroes of the uprising, quickly faded back into the anonymity of the slums. Kid Blink, Racetrack Higgins, and Spot Conlon had their moment in the national spotlight, their names printed in papers across the country, but they remained, fundamentally, poor children. The very nature of the newsboy trade meant their identities were fluid and often fabricated. Reports about Kid Blink's later life are murky and contradictory, suggesting he may have briefly accepted a bribe, only to be rejected by his peers, before eventually finding work as a cart driver or saloon keeper. His story, like that of so many impoverished children, underscores the ephemeral nature of their fame. They were useful to the press as a story, but disposable once the headlines faded. The lasting impact of the strike, however, resonated beyond the immediate circumstances. The economic reality of the buyback. The compromise fundamentally altered the financial risk structure for the newsboys. Before, the business was entirely seller beware, a pure consignment model, where the newsboy absorbed all the losses from unsold papers. With the buyback, the boys only paid for the papers they successfully sold. This guaranteed their essential half-cent profit per paper, shielding them from the devastating impact of slow sales or bad weather or poor news days. For a child living paycheck to paycheck, or rather sale to sale, this was a revolutionary improvement that provided a vital level of financial stability. A spark for labor. While the newsboys never formed a lasting official union, their strike was a powerful, symbolic moment in American labor history. It demonstrated that workers, regardless of their age or formal status, could organize and effectively wield economic leverage. The newsboys' success inspired similar, though often less successful strikes in other cities across the Northeast, including New Haven, Boston, and Fall River. This collective action contributed to the growing wave of labor organizing and industrial protest that characterized the Progressive era. Shining a light on child labor. The most significant long-term impact of the strike was its role in fueling the national conversation around child labor. The spectacle of thousands of impoverished children successfully taking on two titans of industry forced the American public to confront the realities of life for the urban working poor. Photojournalists like Lewis Hine would later document the harsh conditions of child laborers, but the Newsboys strike provided an early, dramatic, and highly public focus on the exploitation of children. The Newsboys strike, though it did not immediately lead to the passage of child labor laws, which would take decades of sustained effort by organizations like the National Child Labor Committee, provided momentum and emotional evidence for the progressive era reformers. It highlighted the lack of protection for independent child workers, whose jobs fell outside the traditional factory and mining sectors that were the initial targets of labor regulation. The image of the Newsie, popularized and romanticized by the strike, became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of youthful resilience and the stark inequalities of the Gilded Age. From their brief, loud moment on the world stage, the New York Newsboys of 1999 etched their story into the annals of American activism, proving that the foundation of even the mightiest empire can be shaken when the voices of the marginalized rise in unison to demand justice. They won a compromise, not a cure. But in that victory, they achieved something far more lasting. They earned respect and proved the power of collective will.